Chapter 13 of Napoleon I, An Intimate Biography, by Walter Geer. This recording is in the public domain. 13. 1806. Jena and Auerstadt. From the tactical point of view, Austerlitz was Napoleon's greatest battle. He was still to gain many other victories, but none so brilliant or so decisive. Up to this time fortune had always smiled upon him. The hour had not yet come when he was to make too great demands upon her favors. 14 months later, amidst the blood and snow of the cemetery on the frozen plain of Eylau, he was to have something like a gloomy vision of the future, a prophetic perspective of the Russian disaster, the first warning of an outraged Providence. He was then to remark, "This scene is enough to inspire in princes the love of peace and the hatred of war." But no such thoughts came to his mind at Austerlitz. War then appeared to him only on its brilliant side. On the 3rd and 4th of December Napoleon sent Josephine letters giving a full description of the extent of his victory. Peace with Austria had been agreed upon, and the Russians were going home. "The battle of Austerlitz is the finest of all that I have fought. 45 flags, more than 150 pieces of cannon, the standards of the Russian Guard, more than 20,000 killed, a horrible sight." From Austerlitz Napoleon went on the 5th to Vienna. The middle of November he had written Josephine at Strasbourg, instructing her to proceed to Munich, where he now went to join her. In the Bavarian capital he was surrounded by all the princes of the South German states. The Margrave of Baden was then 70 years of age. He had lost his son, and his heir was his grandson Charles, then 20 years of age. The mother of this young prince was very much opposed to the French in her sympathies, and one of his sisters had married the Czar, who was still at war with Napoleon. Another sister had married the Elector of Bavaria, and he himself was the fiancé of the young Princess Augusta, the Elector's daughter by a previous marriage. These family arrangements, however, did not meet the approval of Napoleon, who had other plans in view. The Empress arrived at Munich the 5th of December, and a few days later the rumor was circulated that her son Eugene was to marry the Princess Augusta. Maximilian, Elector of Bavaria, was then 50 years old. He had lost his first wife, by whom he had one daughter, Augusta, born in 1788. He had then married Caroline, the sister of Prince Charles of Baden, to whom Augusta was betrothed. The Elector was entirely French in his sympathies. Belonging to the cadet branch of the family, he had only become Elector by the extinction of the reigning branch. He had no fortune as a youth, and under Louis XVI he had served in the French army and commanded the regiment of Alsace. The happiest days of his life had been passed in France. The Treaty of Presburg gave to Baden, Bavaria, and Würtemberg very considerable increases of territory, and the two electors the title of king. Napoleon had decided that these aggrandizements should be paid for by 3 marriages: that of his stepson, Prince Eugene, with Augusta, the daughter of the King of Bavaria; that of Prince Charles of Baden, with Josephine's cousin by marriage, Stéphanie de Beauharnais; and that of his brother Jérôme, with the Princess Catherine, daughter of the King of Würtemberg. On New Year's Eve, Napoleon entered Munich under a triumphal arch erected in his honor. 4 days later he wrote Eugene to start at once for Munich, and to travel incognito as rapidly as possible. Napoleon was desirous of returning at once to Paris, where his presence was necessary, but he remained at Munich to overcome the objections of the Queen to the marriage. In all justice to Napoleon, it must be said that he endeavored to gain his ends only by pleasant means. He exercised all of his powers of seduction, and was so attentive to the Queen that he even aroused the jealousy of Josephine. Eugene arrived at Munich on the 10th of January. The Viceroy of Italy was then 24 years of age. Without being handsome, he had a perfect figure. Like his father, he danced well, and excelled in all kinds of physical exercises. He was frank and simple in his manners, and affable with everybody. He had a very gay disposition, and was always happy. Napoleon was very fond of him, and treated him like a son. Eugene showed much tact in his relations with his future wife, and courted her as assiduously as if their marriage was not already arranged. The fears of the young princess soon gave place to joy, and what was to have been a mariage de raison became a real mariage d'amour. The wedding took place on the 14th January, 1806, in the royal chapel, and was celebrated with great pomp. Napoleon formally adopted Eugène, and in the marriage contract gave him the name of Napoleon Eugène de France. In the future he always addressed him in his letters as "mon fils." The Princess Augusta proved to be a model wife and mother, and the marriage was a very happy one. After the downfall of the Empire, she resisted all the efforts of her family to have her abandon her husband, and remained faithful to the end. A week after the wedding, Eugène and his wife left for Milan, while the Emperor and Empress started for Paris, arriving at the Tuileries the night of the 26th of January. On the 1st of January, 1806, the Republican calendar came to an end after 13 years, 3 months, and 10 days. So the last vestige of the Republic was effaced, except the inscription "République Française, Napoléon Empereur" on the coins. On the 8th of April, 1806, in the chapel of the Tuileries, was celebrated with great pomp the marriage of Stéphanie de Beauharnais with Prince Charles of Baden. If anything could prove the power which the victor of Austerlitz then exercised over the continent, it was certainly this marriage of the daughter of a French senator with a prince belonging to one of the oldest and most illustrious families in Europe, who by his 3 sisters was the brother-in-law of the Czar of Russia, of the King of Sweden, and of the King of Bavaria. What, then, was the origin of the young girl whom the prince had married? The Marquis de Beauharnais, the father of Josephine's first husband, had a brother Claude, who had a son of the same name, who was the father of Stéphanie, born at Paris the 28th of August, 1789. After the death of her mother she was confided to the care of an aunt, a religieuse, who brought her up. Her maternal uncle had the happy thought of taking her to Paris and presenting her to the wife of the First Consul. Josephine, who was her aunt à la mode de Bretagne, took an interest in the girl and sent her to the school of Madame Campan. When she came to the Tuileries after finishing her education, Napoleon took a great fancy to her, and a month before her marriage he formally adopted her as his daughter, thus giving her precedence at court over his own sisters. This second marriage arranged by Napoleon also proved a very happy one. Stéphanie won the affections of her new family and of her subjects, and her death in 1860 during the Second Empire was much regretted, both in Baden and at Paris. Her eldest daughter, Louise, became the mother of the Queen of Saxony. The second, Josephine, was the mother of the first King of Romania, and of that Prince of Hohenzollern, who, as candidate for the Spanish throne in 1870, was the indirect cause of the Franco-German War. The youngest daughter, Marie, married the Duke of Hamilton, a great Scotch lord. The day after the signature of the Treaty of Presburg, Napoleon announced in a military order addressed to the army that the Bourbon dynasty in Naples had ceased to reign. Even the Austrian historian Fournier says that "the pretext for this step had, it must be acknowledged, been furnished by the Neapolitan court itself." During the campaign of Austerlitz, Queen Caroline had deliberately broken her promise given to France in August to remain neutral, and had opened the port of Naples to British and Russian troops. After the battle the Czar recalled his troops, and the English government followed his example. Napoleon made no reply to the abject letter of the Queen imploring his clemency, and sent his troops to take possession of Naples, whence the royal family had taken flight. On the 30th of March, 1806, Napoleon announced his intention of making his brother Joseph King of Naples, without forfeiture of his rights to the imperial succession. At the same time, in another decree, the Emperor announced the formation of 20 titular duchies in the newly acquired Italian territory, 1/15 of the revenue from these lands amounting to from 60 to 100,000 francs a year in each case, to serve as an endowment. The new duchies were conferred upon the marshals and other dignitaries of the Empire. Following is a partial list of the dukes as later appointed: Dalmatia, Soult, Istria, Bessières, Friuli, Duroc, Belluno, Victor, Treviso, Mortier, Bassano, Marais, Vicenza, Caulaincourt, Rovigo, Savary, Otranto, Fouché, Taranto, Macdonald, and Reggio, Udino. Among the other titles conferred by the Emperor at this time or later were Murat, Grand-Duc de Berg et de Clèves, Talleyrand, Prince de Bénévent, Berthier, Prince de Neufchâtel, and Bernadotte, Prince de Pontecorvo. Napoleon next turned his attention to Holland. This country had been conquered by the Republican armies, and had been brought entirely under French influences. The Batavian Republic had been established with a sort of consular government having a grand pensionary at its head. Soon after the establishment of the Empire, there was a rumor at the Hague that Napoleon intended to set up a monarchy again in the Low Countries. Early in 1806 a deputation of Dutch notables, with Admiral Verhuell at their head, was sent to Paris to avert the threatened danger. In a letter to Talleyrand, 14th of March, 1806, the Emperor stated his intention of re-establishing the monarchy with his brother Louis as king. The opposition of the Dutch delegation was swept away, and on the 5th of June, 1806, at the Tuileries, Napoleon announced the establishment of the new monarchy under King Louis. The primary cause of the breach between France and Prussia in 1806 was the question of Hanover. This electorate since 1714 had been under the sovereignty of Great Britain. In that year the Elector George Louis became George I, King of Great Britain and Ireland, through inheritance from his mother, who was the granddaughter of James I of England. The first two Georges preferred Hanover to England as a place of residence, and George III was the first Hanoverian king who was English in his sympathies. In 1803, when war was renewed between England and France, Napoleon sent an army under Mortier to occupy Hanover. Prussia had long been anxious to possess the electorate in order to round out her lands, which were much separated by intervening territory, and Napoleon used Hanover as a bait to keep Prussia neutral during the campaign of 1805. The Allies at the same time were endeavoring to obtain the support of Prussia, and the Czar Alexander visited Berlin for this purpose, when he was on his way to join his army in Moravia. Queen Louisa at this time conceived the idea of uniting the two sovereigns by a solemn oath, and at midnight on the 4th of November, 1805, Alexander and Frederick William went to the garrison church at Potsdam, where over the tomb of Frederick the Great they bound themselves to support the Allied cause. Prussia, however, was not then ready for war, and demanded until the middle of December to complete her preparations. Before that date arrived, the battle of Austerlitz was fought, and Austria sued for peace. Under the changed conditions, Napoleon was no longer willing to allow Prussia to maintain even a neutral position, and demanded an alliance with France. This compact was signed at Vienna the 15th of December, 1805. At the same time, England was also endeavoring to obtain the support of Prussia, and Frederick William was placed in an embarrassing position. He had to choose between the half of Belgium and the Rhineland as offered by England, and Hanover as a gift from Napoleon. On the 3rd of January, in 1806, an important State Council was held at Berlin, at which it was decided to demand of Napoleon some important modifications to the Schönbrunn Treaty. Prussia was endeavoring, in short, to steer half-way between France and England, and gain Hanover. The Prussian government was so sure of Napoleon's acceptance of the proposed changes, that it was decided to put the army at once on a peace footing. The Emperor, however, took the ground that as Prussia had not formally ratified the treaty as drawn, it was null and void. Having thoroughly frightened the Prussian envoy, Napoleon came at once to the point he wished to gain, and demanded that the North Sea ports of Germany should be closed to English commerce. This agreed to, Hanover was handed over to Prussia. It was indeed a Greek gift. The acceptance of Hanover on those terms meant the disapproval of Russia and the hostility of England. In the spring of 1806, overtures of peace were exchanged between Paris, London, and St. Petersburg, and there seemed hope that after 14 years of almost continual war, Europe might find some repose. Even the English historians reluctantly admit that Napoleon seems to have wanted peace for the consolidation of his power in Europe and the extension of his colonies and commerce. Austria was still dazed from the effects of the blow she had received at Austerlitz, and even the Czar was no longer in a warlike mood. The new English ministry was strongly inclined towards peace. Holland, South Germany, and Italy were under the control of Napoleon; the other powers were either helpless or inert. Fox, who had always been favorable to a good understanding with France, was assured by Talleyrand of the pacific desires of the French Emperor. France desired not a truce, but a permanent peace. When informed that George III above all things would require the restoration of Hanover, Talleyrand, after consulting the Emperor, declared that that should not stand in the way. While these negotiations were going on, the 12th of July, 1806, was signed the Act of the Confederation of the Rhine, that ended the old Germanic Empire. After 1,000 years of existence was sounded the death knell of an empire which Voltaire with equal wit and truth had described as neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. The Emperor, Francis II., made no protest, and assumed the title of Francis I. of Austria. "Thus," says Rose, "feebly flickered out the light which had shed splendor on mediaeval Christendom. Kindled in the Basilica of St. Peter's on Christmas Day of the year 800, in an almost mystical union of spiritual and earthly power, by the blessing of Pope Leo on Karl the Great, it was now trodden under foot by the chief of a more than Frankish state, who aspired to unquestioned sway over a dominion as great as that of the mediaeval hero. For Napoleon, as protector of the Rhenish Confederation, now controlled most of the German lands that acknowledged Charlemagne, while his hold on Italy was immeasurably stronger. The old German laws were soon replaced by the Code Napoleon, and a close offensive and defensive alliance was formed between Napoleon and the 16 princes of the new confederation, who agreed to furnish 63,000 troops at the demand of the new protector. The principal states included in the confederation were Bavaria, Würtemberg, Baden, Hesse-Darmstadt, and Nassau. At the same time a number of free cities, as well as of imperial counts and knights, were wiped out. Augsburg and Nuremberg were given to the King of Bavaria, and Frankfurt was bestowed on Dalberg, the prince primate of the confederation. It will thus be seen that the first steps toward German unity, which Bismarck was to carry to a conclusion 2 generations later, were taken by the new Charlemagne. The correspondence of Napoleon at this time proves that he was more preoccupied with the affairs of Italy than with those of Germany. For one letter that he wrote about Hanover he sent 20 to Joseph or Eugene, impressing upon them the necessity of keeping a firm hand, and above all of conquering Sicily. But if Sicily was a stumbling block in the negotiations with England, Hanover was the cause of the war with Prussia. Queen Louisa constantly urged her weak and vacillating husband to resist the continued French aggrandizements in Germany, and to ally himself with Russia. Louisa at that time was 30 years of age. The daughter of one of the minor German princes, her youth had been spent in poverty and obscurity, until her charms captured the heart of the Crown Prince of Prussia. A comparison has often been drawn between Louisa and Marie Antoinette. Both were mated with cold and uninteresting consorts. Frederick William, like Louis, could only inspire the respect due to an insignificant but well-meaning man, while all the fervor of loyalty was aroused by his queen. Louisa, however, was more staid and homely than the vivacious daughter of Maria Theresa, and did not interfere much in state affairs until after the crash came. Then she became the inspiration which kindled the fires of German patriotism. At the instigation of the Queen, on the 8th of August, Frederick William sent a letter to the Czar imploring his assistance. Alexander wrote a cheering response promising his help. Thinking to take Napoleon off his guard, Prussia at once began her preparations for war. Napoleon, however, was not deceived, and he adopted towards Frederick William the tone of a friend who is grieved by an unexpected quarrel. He stated that he intended to propose some equivalent for Hanover if England insisted on its restitution as a sine qua non of peace. "But," he added, "if your young officers and your women at Berlin want war, I am preparing to satisfy them. Yet my ambition turns wholly to Italy. She is a mistress whose favors I will share with no one. On North Germany I have no claims." The whole tenor of Napoleon's correspondence shows that before the first week in September he did not expect a new coalition. As Rose admits, "It is perfectly true that he did not make war on Prussia in 1806, any more than on England in 1803. He only made peace impossible." This final statement is simply begging the question. One might as well say that Serbia, in 1914, made peace impossible, when she failed to yield to the unreasonable demands of Austria. The condition on which Prussia urgently insisted was the entire evacuation of Germany by French troops, which Napoleon refused until Prussia demobilized her army. In the meantime, Russia was awaiting the arrival of a Prussian officer at St. Petersburg to concert a plan of campaign. When he came he had no plan, and the Czar refused to march his troops into Prussia. Austria also refused to move until the Allies had gained a victory. So, at the outbreak of the war, Prussia could only count on the feeble support of Saxony and Weimar. The Prussian war party had now gained complete control, and an ultimatum was sent Napoleon on the 6th of September, demanding that he should immediately evacuate Germany, and should send an answer before the 8th of October. No more short-sighted act can well be conceived than this throwing down the gauntlet to Napoleon, who had 180,000 veterans already in Germany, while Prussia's ally the Czar could not get his troops on the field of operations for months to come. Napoleon at this time had a population of nearly 60 millions from which to draw troops, and during the Jena campaign he had 80,000 men in training in France in addition to the grand army of 200,000 men in Germany. As Napoleon himself stood like a giant among all the captains of his age, so also the grand army was in a class by itself. The world had never before known so superb a fighting organization. Prussia, including its ally Saxony, had a population of some 12 millions from which to draw its army. The country was not rich, and the government was hopelessly out of date. Nothing had been changed since the days of Frederick, but the inspiring soul of the great king was no longer there. At the beginning of hostilities the Prussian army, including the Saxon contingent, did not much exceed 150,000 men, ready for duty. The army was also poorly armed and equipped. Like the French army at the outbreak of the Franco-German War, it was living on the traditions of the past, and believed itself to be the first army in the world, but with no solid basis for its confidence. The commanders were not deficient in ability, but were lacking in experience. As Dodge pithily sums up the situation, "The French army believed itself to be superior, and was actually so. The Prussian army believed itself to be superior, and was not." After the peace of Pressburg, the Grand Army had not returned home, but on one pretext or another had been kept in South Germany. In August, 1806, the army lay mostly in Bavaria, and was under the command of Berthier, whose headquarters were at Munich. As a further proof that Napoleon at the beginning of September was not expecting war, there may be cited this letter of the 4th to Berthier, authorizing him to give leaves of absence to a number of officers, and to take one himself. A few days later the situation became more menacing. On the 10th the Emperor wrote Berthier from Paris that his horses were starting the next day, and that the Guard was soon to follow. This body of 13,000 picked men, under the command of Bessières, was transported from Paris to Mayence by post in 700 four-horse wagons, and covered the distance of 260 miles in 8 days. From Mayence northeast through Erfurt and Weimar to Berlin ran the most important road in Germany. Midway between Weimar and the capital it crossed at right angles the Elbe, which was defended by several large fortresses. This road formed the direct route from Paris to Berlin, and was to figure conspicuously in the campaign now about to open. The Prussian army, after passing the Elbe, advanced slowly in a great semicircle stretching out on either side of the Mayence road. On the 5th of October the headquarters at Erfurt and the army was extended on a front of 90 miles from Cassel to Rudolstadt, south of Jena, watching the Thuringian forest from which the French were expected to debouch. In the meantime Napoleon was preparing to concentrate his corps at Bamberg and Bayreuth, and swing around the left bank of the Prussian army, cutting it off from its base on the Elbe, just as he had turned Max right the previous year, and cut him off from the Inn. On the 5th the front of the French army, covering not more than 35 miles, was between Coburg and Hof. Pressing on by long marches, a week later the French left was in contact with the extreme left of the Prussians at Saalfeld, a little south of Jena, while the French center and right was getting into a line roughly indicated by Jena and Naumburg. The Grand Army was moving in 3 columns: Soult and Ney on the right, Bernadotte and Davout with the Guard in the center, and Lannes and Augereau at the left. The first column was 50,000 strong, the second 70, and the third 40. When the Prussian commander, the Duke of Brunswick, learned that the French had turned his left flank and were rapidly advancing on his line of communications, he issued orders for a general movement eastward in the hope of being able to retreat towards the Elbe by way of Jena and Naumburg. But he was a few hours too late, and was obliged to fight with the enemy on his line of communications. On the 13th the Emperor received a dispatch from Lannes stating that he had found the Prussians in force at Jena, and was hourly expecting an attack. Napoleon immediately started for that place. On his arrival he found that the enemy had withdrawn from the town, and that Lannes had taken possession of it, and had also occupied the steep heights of the Landgrafenberg, lying beyond it. At 4 o'clock Napoleon rode up on this plateau, which dominates the entire country to the west. Dismounting, he walked to the edge of the plateau and studied the enemy's position. He thought that he had the main Prussian army before him, although he could only see 40,000 or 50,000 troops. He ordered Lannes to place his entire corps on the heights; and the Guard and Soult, as well as Ney and Augereau, were instructed to march on Jena with all possible speed. Meanwhile, Davout and Bernadotte had reached Naumburg, and Murat, with the cavalry, was in that vicinity. The field on which was fought the double battle of Jena and Auerstadt lies within a theatre about 14 miles north and south by 18 miles east and west. At the southwest corner lies the beautiful city of Weimar. 10 miles to the east, between the steep and rugged plateau of the Landgrafenberg and the Saale, is situated the old university town of Jena. The river Saale runs in a northeasterly direction from Jena to Naumburg, 5 miles to the west of which is located the battlefield of Auerstadt. Excellent roads lead from Weimar to Jena, and from both places to Naumburg. The country is much cut up by hill and dale, but there are few woods, and the ground is suitable for all arms. To debouch from Jena towards Weimar, however, is not easy, owing to the hills and ravines, and the possession of the dominating plateau is very essential. On the south of the heights sinks away into the valley the Muhltal, through which runs the Weimar road. The Prussian commander Hohenlohe, thinking the Muhltal was the only feasible line of approach, posted most of his forces there, leaving the plateau free. Under cover of the darkness, Napoleon not only crowded all of Lannes's corps on the heights, but also had dragged up whole batteries of artillery. The task was tremendous, and would not have been accomplished without the inspiration of the presence of the Emperor and his practical skill. While his officers were asleep, he personally directed the work. By such untiring energy did he assure victory. Jena was won by the rapid concentration of his troops and the seizing of a commanding position almost under the eyes of an unsuspecting enemy. During the night the corps of Soult and Ney came up and went into line on the right, while Augereau on his arrival was posted in the valley on the left. A dense fog early in the morning screened the positions of the troops, but by 10 o'clock the fog lifted, and revealed to the astonished eyes of the Prussians the whole French army in line of battle. The attack was begun by Lannes in the center, and was followed by the advance of Soult and Augereau on either wing. When the attack had fully developed, the Emperor launched the Guard and Murat's cavalry on the lines of the wavering Prussians. The impact was irresistible, and Hohenlohe's force was swept away. At the crisis of the battle, after the arrival of reinforcements under Ruckel, the Prussians had only 47,000 men on the field, while Napoleon then had 83,000 troops at his disposal. At the same time, at Auerstadt, about 10 miles to the north, Davout, with his single corps of 27,000 men, was facing the main Prussian army, composed of 55,000 of their choicest troops. The King and Brunswick were marching on Naumburg in order to gain the main road to Berlin and make sure their line of retreat to the Elbe, when their advance cavalry under Blucher saw a solid line of French infantry loom through the morning mist. It was part of the corps of Davout, strongly posted in and around the village of Assenhausen, midway between Naumburg and Auerstadt. Blucher at once charged, but was repulsed with heavy loss. Again and again Brunswick sent his troops to the attack, but the steady fire of the French infantry laid him low with most of his officers. The Prussians, according to tradition, advanced in solid masses, while the French fought in skirmish lines, and fired at will from behind hedges and walls, trees and rocks, and out of ditches and sunken roads. This fire was murderous, and the gallant Prussian officers were picked off one by one. Failing to make any headway, the Prussians began to fall back in disorder. Davout now pressed the attack, and nothing could resist the French ardor. The King gave the order to retreat on Weimar, where he hoped to rejoin his right wing and renew the battle on the morrow. But instead of an army, it was a terrified mob flying before Murat's cavalry that he met halfway between Auerstadt and Weimar. The French victory was complete, and no praise is too high for Davout's intelligence and courage. Bernadotte was very seriously criticized by the Emperor for his conduct on the day of the two battles. At 10 o'clock on the evening of the 13th, Napoleon, in the belief that the entire Prussian army was before him, had sent an order to Davout to advance to Apolda, to the north of Vienna, and take the enemy on the left flank or in the rear. He added, "If Marshal Bernadotte is with you, you can march together, but the Emperor hopes that he will be in the position indicated to him at Dornberg." This order was received by Davout about 3 o'clock in the morning. Convinced from his reconnaissance that he had a very large Prussian force in front of him, Davout strongly urged Bernadotte to remain, even going so far as to offer him the command of the two corps. But he persisted in obeying the letter rather than the spirit of the Emperor's order, and started for Dornberg. Finding much difficulty in crossing the Saale, he did not reach Apolda until nightfall, and so took no part in either battle. He had no doubt literally obeyed orders, but as Dodge justly remarks, "A corps commander is held to more than this." The pursuit of the defeated army by Murat was the most extraordinary in history. In 3 weeks he all but literally galloped from Jena to Lubeck on the Baltic Sea. With a large force of cavalry, together with the corps of Lannes, Soult, and Bernadotte, he swept up all the remnants of the Prussian army, and captured all of the fortresses as he passed. On the 7th of November he stormed Lubeck, and forced Blucher, the last to hold out, to surrender with 20,000 men. This short campaign is without parallel, even in Napoleon's marvelous career. In 7 weeks he practically extended the French frontier from the Rhine to the Vistula. 100,000 prisoners, 4,000 guns, and other trophies without number, were the fruits of one able strategic manoeuvre. Napoleon reached Potsdam on Saturday, the 25th of October, 1806, 11 days after the battle of Jena, and took up his quarters in the Palace of Sans Souci, the Versailles of Frederick the Great. On Sunday he visited the Garrison Church, where in a vault under the severely plain Lutheran pulpit is the marble sarcophagus which contains the ashes of the king. He ordered sent to the Hôtel des Invalides at Paris the sword and hat and sash of the great warrior which lay upon his tomb. Departing now for the first time from his usual practice, the Emperor arranged to enter Berlin in triumph on Monday. Let us try to picture this scene, worthy of the painter's brush. At the further end of Unter den Linden, away from the royal palace, that famous avenue broadens out into the Pariser Platz. Thence one can gaze through the stately Brandenburger Tor, and view the Tiergarten with its green alleys and its glints of snowy marble. The wide avenue is lined with thousands of spectators. While the assembled crowd awaits with intense expectancy, from the direction of Charlottenburg there comes a faint murmur like the far-away sound of surf upon the shore. It grows and swells, and then it deepens into a sort of muffled thunder pierced by the roll of distant drums. Soon can be seen the glint of sun on steel. Now rings out the clear call of the bugles, and down one of the broad allees come the Mamelukes on their superb horses, and draw rein beside the Brandenburger Tor. Then follows a great flood of splendid cavalry, squadron upon squadron of the cuirassiers of the Imperial Guard, wearing the steel helmets with brass crests and flowing horsehair. On they ride, not with the stolid surly mien of the Prussians, but swinging lightly in their saddles, their faces aglow with that ardor which belongs to the most martial nation in the world. Far as the eye can reach follow regiments of the sturdy infantry of the Guard, with their high bearskin caps, filling the whole vast area of the Tiergarten. Riding 100 paces ahead is the Emperor, on a small white Arabian horse. He wears a plain gray redingote, and the well-known hat with the black cord, without any ornament save the little cockade. His unbuttoned overcoat enables one to see the uniform of the Chasseurs de la Garde, with its green coat upon which glisten the star and the plaque of the Légion d'honneur. The waistcoat and the breeches are white, and he wears soft riding boots. The saddle cloth is edged with rich bullion fringe, and the bit and bridle buckles as well as the stirrups are gold-plated. Just behind the Emperor come 3 of his marshals, with their waving plumes and their uniforms covered with gold. In the center is the martial figure of Berthier, the trusted chief of staff. At his right is Davout, the hero of Auerstadt, with his round and placid face. At the left is the tall and handsome Augereau, who has won new laurels at Jena, Then at the head of the aides de camp, and followed by the brilliant staff, comes Duroc, the marshal of the palace, whose face is well known in Berlin, where twice he has been sent on a special mission by his master. As the Emperor nears the Tor, the glorious tricolor is unfurled, surmounted by the Napoleonic eagles; and as the music swells into a tempest of martial melody rolling up the Linden, and flooding it with a glorious sea of sound, 10,000 sabres flash in air, and 10,000 strident voices cry, "Vive l'Empereur!" All eyes are focused, not on the marshals and the brilliant staff, but on the figure of the chief in his plain uniform. He is no longer the slim and sallow youth of the campaign of Italy. Amidst toils that would have worn most men to a shadow, he has grown to the roundness of robust health; the face no longer thin with the unsatisfied longings of youth, but square and full with toil requited and ambition well nigh sated; a visage redeemed from the coarseness of the epicures only by the knitted brows that bespoke ceaseless thought, and by the keen, melancholy, unfathomable eyes. CHAPTER XIV.